Imagine a world where a soccer match doesn't just end with cheers or jeers, but with bombs, gunfire, and thousands of lives lost. On July 14, 1969, that's exactly what happened between two Central American nations, El Salvador and Honduras. What began as a heated sports rivalry spiraled into a full-blown conflict known as the Football War, a 4-day clash that left scars still felt today. We're going to unravel this extraordinary story, one that weaves together the passion of soccer, the weight of history, and the tragedy of human conflict. Was it really just a game that sparked this bloodshed, or were there deeper tensions simmering beneath the surface? We are Chronicles of Eras, and we're here to guide you through this journey. If you love history, sports, or stories that challenge what you think you know, you're in the right place. Before we dive in, hit that like button, subscribe for more untold stories, and let's get started. Let's set the stage in the late 1960s, a time of growing unrest in Central America. El Salvador was a tiny nation, roughly the size of Massachusetts, but its population was bursting at the seams. By 1969, over 3 million people lived there, making it one of the most densely populated countries in the Western Hemisphere. Land was a precious commodity, but most of it was controlled by a small group of wealthy families who owned vast estates while the majority struggled to survive. For the average Salvadoran, life was a constant battle. Jobs were scarce, wages were low, and the dream of owning even a small plot of land to grow food for their families felt like an impossible fantasy. Many families lived in cramped conditions, often sharing small homes with multiple generations under one roof, and the pressure for space was relentless. Across the border, Honduras offered a stark contrast. It was 5 times larger than El Salvador, with sprawling farmlands and a smaller population of about 2.5 million. For decades, Salvadorans had migrated to Honduras in search of opportunity, drawn by the promise of work and land. By 1969, an estimated 300,000 Salvadorans had settled there, working as farmers, laborers, and small business owners. They built vibrant communities, raised families, and contributed to the local economy. Some even started schools and churches, creating a sense of home in a foreign land. But their presence wasn't always welcomed by everyone. Honduran landowners, especially those with large agricultural estates, began to feel threatened by the growing number of Salvadoran workers. They worried that these migrants were taking jobs and land that should belong to Hondurans, and they started to pressure their government to take action. In the late 1960s, Honduras introduced land reform laws aimed at redistributing land to its own citizens. While the intention was to support local farmers, the reality was far harsher for Salvadoran migrants. These laws led to widespread evictions. Salvadoran families were forcibly removed from their homes, their crops were burned, and their livelihoods were destroyed. Violence became a daily reality for many. Reports from the time described horrific acts: beatings in the streets, homes set ablaze in the middle of the night, and even murders targeting Salvadoran communities. One survivor, Maria Gonzalez, shared a chilling memory in a 1970 interview with a local newspaper. They came at night with torches. They burned everything we had, our crops, our clothes, our memories. We had nowhere to go, so we hid in the forest for days, terrified they'd find us. The border between El Salvador and Honduras became a tinderbox, with small clashes breaking out regularly. Families on both sides lived in fear, unsure of when the next wave of violence would strike. Meanwhile, both nations were dealing with their own internal struggles. El Salvador was under the iron grip of a military junta, its government cracking down on any form of dissent with brutal force. Political activists were arrested, and protests were met with violence, leaving the population feeling trapped and powerless. The economy was on the brink of collapse, with inflation soaring and basic goods becoming harder to afford. Honduras wasn't faring much better. It too was ruled by a military regime, one plagued by corruption scandals that eroded public trust. Poverty was widespread, and rural communities felt neglected by a government that seemed more interested in protecting the interests of the elite than addressing the needs of its people. Into this volatile mix came soccer, the sport that both united and divided the region. Soccer wasn't just a pastime in Central America. It was a cultural obsession, a source of national pride, and a way for people to channel their hopes and frustrations. As the 1970 World Cup qualifiers approached, the matches between El Salvador and Honduras became more than just games. They became a stage for national identity, a release for years of pent-up anger, and a dangerous spark in an already explosive situation. The tension boiled over in June 1969, when El Salvador and Honduras faced off in a series of World Cup qualifier matches. The first game took place on June 8th in Tegucigalpa, the capital of Honduras. From the moment the Salvadoran team arrived, the atmosphere was hostile. Honduran fans gathered outside the team's hotel the night before the match, banging pots and pans, honking car horns, and shouting insults to keep the players awake. "We didn't sleep at all," one Salvadoran player later told a reporter. "It was psychological warfare. We were exhausted before we even stepped onto the field." The next day, the game itself was a pressure cooker. The stadium was packed with over 15,000 fans, most of them cheering for Honduras with a fierce intensity. The match was physical, with hard tackles and heated arguments breaking out between players. Honduras won 1-0, a narrow victory that sent the home crowd into a frenzy of celebration. But the real chaos erupted after the final whistle. Salvadoran fans trying to leave the stadium were attacked by locals. 2 were killed in the violence, and dozens more were injured in the riots that raged into the night. News of the deaths spread quickly, reaching El Salvador within hours. The loss was seen as a national humiliation, and the violence against Salvadoran fans added fuel to the fire. Radio stations aired emotional appeals, with broadcasters calling the events in Tegucigalpa an affront to Salvadoran pride. Newspapers ran inflammatory headlines like, "Honduras humiliates us," stirring up anger across the country. The second match on June 15th in San Salvador was El Salvador's chance to strike back. This time, the Honduran team faced their own intimidation. Crowds surrounded their hotel in the days leading up to the game, throwing bottles, rocks, and even dead rats through the windows. On the day of the match, the stadium was a cauldron of hostility. Some fans in the stands were seen waving guns, and the Honduran national anthem was drowned out by boos and jeers. El Salvador dominated the game, winning 3-0, but the victory came at a heavy cost. As Honduran fans tried to leave the stadium, they were attacked by angry mobs. Several were beaten, and the Honduran flag was publicly burned in the streets, an act of defiance that sent shockwaves through Honduras. The violence didn't stop there. In the days that followed, reports emerged of attacks on Honduran communities living in El Salvador, with families targeted simply for their nationality. The deciding match took place on June 27th in Mexico City, a neutral ground chosen to avoid further violence. It was a grueling battle, with the score tied at 2-2 until extra time, when El Salvador scored the winning goal, securing a 3-2 victory and their spot in the World Cup. For a moment, El Salvador erupted in celebration. Their team had triumphed, and their national pride was restored. But the joy was short-lived. By now, the soccer rivalry had become a symbol of deep-seated hatred between the two nations. In Honduras, Salvadoran migrants faced a wave of reprisals. Homes were looted, families were attacked, and thousands were forced to flee for their lives. In El Salvador, anti-Honduran sentiment reached a fever pitch, with newspapers calling for retaliation and politicians fanning the flames of nationalism. The matches had amplified existing tensions to a breaking point, and the region was on the brink of disaster. On July 14th, just weeks after the final match, El Salvador's military crossed the border, launching an attack that would plunge both nations into chaos. Grainy footage of military movements, planes bombing, displaced families, and destroyed villages. The football war had begun. On July 14, 1969, El Salvador's military, better equipped and more organized than its counterpart, struck with precision. They crossed into Honduras, capturing key border towns like Nuevo Ocotepeque and pushing toward the capital, Tegucigalpa. The Salvadoran forces moved quickly, using tanks and artillery to overwhelm Honduran defenses. Honduras responded with its small air force, launching airstrikes on Salvadoran targets. Many of these planes were relics from World War II, barely operational, but they still managed to drop bombs on military bases and civilian areas alike. The fighting was brutal. Soldiers clashed in the rugged hills along the border, while civilians caught in the crossfire fled for their lives. For 4 days from July 14th to July 18th, the region was engulfed in violence. Estimates vary, but up to 3,000 people were killed, most of them civilians who had nothing to do with the conflict. The human toll was devastating. Salvadoran migrants in Honduras were forced to abandon their homes, many walking for days with children in tow, carrying only what they could hold. One refugee, Juan Lopez, later shared his harrowing experience with a historian. "We left everything behind, our farm, our animals, our entire life. We walked through the mountains, hearing bombs in the distance. I thought we'd never make it." Villages on both sides of the border were reduced to rubble, with homes, schools, and churches destroyed in the fighting. Bridges were blown up, cutting off vital supply routes, and both nations' fragile economies suffered catastrophic losses. The war disrupted trade, halted agricultural production, and left thousands homeless. On July 18th, the Organization of American States stepped in, brokering a ceasefire that finally halted the fighting. But the ceasefire couldn't erase the pain. Families were torn apart, communities were shattered, and the mistrust between El Salvador and Honduras deepened. The war ended with no clear victor, only a shared sense of loss and devastation. So did a soccer match really cause a war? Not exactly. The games were the spark, but the fire came from decades of land disputes, migration tensions, and political instability. Historians like Dr. Thomas Anderson, who wrote extensively about the conflict, argued that the soccer matches simply gave both nations an excuse to unleash their frustrations. The war was inevitable, Anderson wrote in his 1971 book, The War of the Dispossessed. The matches were a convenient trigger, but the real causes were economic inequality, political oppression, and the failure of both governments to address the root issues. It took over a decade for El Salvador and Honduras to sign a peace treaty, finally agreeing to terms in 1980. Even then, border disputes lingered, with skirmishes breaking out sporadically until the 1990s, when the International Court of Justice stepped in to settle the land claims once and for all. Today, the football war serves as a cautionary tale, a reminder of how sports can amplify deeper societal divides when left unchecked. Soccer remains a beloved sport in both El Salvador and Honduras, but the memory of 1969 lingers as a lesson in the power of unity and division. What do you think? Can a game ever justify such a conflict? Drop your thoughts in the comments, give this video a like if you found it fascinating, and subscribe for more history deep dives. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.